Hello everybody and welcome to my review for Total War 3 Kingdoms. So I wanted to first establish how I'm approaching this review. My review is from the perspective of someone who's played all of the Total War games, so I can't help but form some comparisons to them, and I'm someone who is interested in the time period, but I didn't really know much about the romance of the Three Kingdoms itself. I'm also someone who's interested in realism, or at least perceived realism and immersion in Total War games, and games in general. If you line up with that, then you'll be able to relate to this review a lot more, but even if you don't, I'll try to be as objective as I can regarding the mechanics and gameplay experience. So, Total War 3 Kingdoms has two different modes that affect both the campaign and battles, Romance Mode and Records Mode. Now before we get into the review, I thought we should quickly outline the differences between the two modes. In Romance Mode, characters are single entity units on the battlefield, they're very powerful, and they have access to magical abilities, some that are just little buffs and debuffs, and some that are a little bit more out there, like fire spells and magic missiles. As well as that, characters can engage each other in duels. These are bespoke 1v1 fights in which characters lock into combat and cannot be interrupted unless either side gives up. I'll discuss duels a little bit later in the battle section of the review. The other thing in Romance Mode is that generals will exchange insults and conversation across the battlefield during the battle. You can turn this off if you want, but you cannot turn it on in Records Mode. Those are the effects in Romance Mode. In Records Mode, characters come with a bodyguard unit. The bodyguard is always a powerful cavalry unit, but the type of cavalry and amount of them is dependent on the character. There are no active abilities on characters at all, not even a rally ability, just passive abilities and pretty tame ones at that. There are no duels in Records Mode. Instead, if two characters meet on the battlefield in their respective units and fight, that's just counted as a duel. So there's no dueling UI, no abilities, and no bespoke animations, but after the fight you'll see that they dueled. In Records Mode, fatigue plays a bit of a bigger part. It drains much faster both when moving and when in combat. It also takes longer to recover from. Now when units become fatigued in either mode, they're less effective in combat. Through some testing, I found that units took about 20% longer in combat in Records Mode than in Romance. However, as it is just fatigue based and not damage or health based, missiles are still going to be doing the same damage regardless, and two fresh units charging will do the same initial damage. So combat is just a little bit longer in Records Mode, especially when there's a frontline stalemate. Of course as well, without abilities to buff or debuff units like in Romance, that's going to have an effect on the pacing as well. The last thing on the battle side is the lighting. Romance and Records Mode utilize separate post-processing effects for saturation, and this can be switched regardless of the mode. So those are the battle differences for the two modes. In the campaign, it's a little bit more unclear. Creative Assembly have said that some events are for Romance only, but without huge testing it's kind of hard to find out what they are. Items like the Imperial Seal are still in Records Mode, and as are events relating to characters like Dong Zhuo and others. From an end user standpoint, the campaign essentially plays the same, the main difference being that characters in Romance Mode have resilience. This is an extra lives mechanic that means that if they die, they will respawn a certain number of times until it runs out, or if they're left alone and safe for a while, it'll build back up. In Records, characters will just die in battle a lot more often, though there is a chance that they will be only wounded if they're powerful enough and lucky enough. Okay, so we know all the differences between the two modes. So for my playthrough, I chose Records Mode. Why? Well, I don't think duels add good gameplay, and this is after playing with them for a little while, which we'll talk about again a little bit later. Another one is just, I'm not personally a fan of magic abilities, and I also prefer a slower paced battle. So let's get into the campaign. So there's 12 playable factions in this campaign, although they're not technically called factions in this game, they're just named after the ruler. Not really too sure why, because it doesn't really make a difference to anything. I guess it's just the character focus. If the ruler dies, for instance, the faction will still play the exact same and have all the same effects, but the name's just going to change, so it's a faction. Anyway, each faction has a different amount of unique units and buildings, as well as access to unique characters and either a special resource or some form of ability. Some actually have extra diplomatic options, for instance. Now I played as Sun Jin primarily, who has a resource called Heroism. As you fight battles, this number goes up, and you get bonuses to upkeep and happiness, and then it'll start trickling back down over time. 7 of the 12 factions have some resource in the game like this that encourages a type of playstyle and rewards you with buffs. There's a decent amount of variety between the factions considering it's all one culture, especially with the different categories. The Coalition are more traditional playstyle, they can kind of do what they want and they have varying degrees of difficulty. Governors, on the other hand, require you to be a little bit more defensive. You have to invest much more into diplomacy and your characters, almost building tall in a way, choosing allies carefully to allow you to expand. And then there's the Outlaws. They're very much on the other side of things. They're much more aggressive, relying on hit and run, sacking, ambushing, to really get ahead and establish a foothold. They benefit from having tributaries and don't get along with others, so it's very much the opposite of the governors. And then there's Dong Zhuo, only unlocked after you complete a campaign. He has the ability to raise settlements and to intimidate people in diplomacy to giving into his demands by spending his unique resource. That's a really interesting playstyle. It's a real bad guy fear campaign type playstyle. There's also the 3 Yellow Turban factions that came with the first week purchases of the game and are now DLC. However, I haven't tried them out yet, and they all seem to be on par with the other factions, at least in terms of their uniqueness. They have unique buildings, units, diplomacy, and different categories of character. So that's the introduction to the campaign. First thing I want to touch on is empire building and province management. Essentially, this game builds on top of the Thrones of Britannia style of province management, but it's a little bit more refined, has a lot more options, which is good. Essentially, you have a province, which in this game is called a commandery, because they need to rename everything. Anyway, a commandery has 1 major settlement in it, and between 1 and 3 minor settlements. The minor settlements are tied to a resource, and so they never change. You basically just always upgrade them. They can really only go up. The major settlements have a main city building that builds up 10 levels. Every 2 or so levels, it'll unlock kind of a new building slot. You use these slots then primarily to buff your resources, and also then to keep your town happy. But there's also options to modify your own income and to bolster the military. You essentially have to balance whether or not you want more income from your resources, extra food from your city, a stronger military kind of buff, or faction-wide unique buildings. There's now a population mechanic of sorts. It's not really population, it is just a bigger growth number, that has a population icon. Like, armies don't recruit from it, and it doesn't affect your tax yield. It's not really there, but it does respond to more things than just growth did in previous games, which is also good, and it's a good indicator of size nevertheless. Reading 700,000 population just gives you an idea in your head rather than growth level 5, for instance. To squeeze more out of a settlement, you can assign it an administrator. This is like a governor who will use their skills and items to get more out of a settlement, be it public order, food, income, or whatever. You can assign them, and then they'll just gain experience over time, and you can make them more effective at it. You can reassign them to a different province later if you wish. Now, there's 2 hindrance mechanics at play for when you begin expanding. One is for when you build wide, you start gaining something called corruption, which is a hard negative percentage to your income. You'll need to counter this with anti-corruption buildings, administrators, and technologies. The second hindrance is for if you build tall. As your population grows, you gain a negative to public order. There's no real explanation why, but there it is. I guess more people, more problems. Essentially what this means is that you'll almost always need to dedicate 2 of your 6 building slots to corruption and public order, as there really isn't a better way of dealing with it. Now, there's no religion or culture in this game, nor is there disease and squalor apart from the odd event. Practically every building just gives you positives and no negatives, and there's no recruitment buildings. It's the first Total War ever where you don't build a building to get a unit out of it. So settlements are pretty simple to manage. Your first campaign, you'll probably spend a lot of time thinking about it, but then once you figure it out, you'll autopilot it from there on. You match the colors, you add some anti-corruption, away you go. It's at its most interesting when you are small and have to decide between things, but when you get to about mid-size, it kind of becomes quite dull in my opinion. It's also worth mentioning that it only allows you to build 1 building at a time, but for a sum of money, you can instantly complete the construction. This is a very arcadey type system, but I think within the design it does work really well. You essentially want to be building all the time in every commandery, and any excess money you make can just speed up your development. However, you will hit a wall eventually that is gated by time because technologies unlock at a set rate. We'll talk about tech a little bit later. I think generally it's much improved over Thrones of Britannia's system. I wasn't able to just color match everything and forget completely, but at the same time it still feels like there's just not enough going on in settlements to make province management interesting. Without an extra layer to population size, without culture, without religion, unit buildings, squalor, there's just not that much to give cities any personality. It's a fine system, it's really not bad, it's just not all that interesting. Now, the most interesting aspects to me were the unique faction-wide buildings and the adjacency buildings. That actually made me think, where do I need to place stuff in my empire as I grow? Do I need to disband this and build it somewhere else? Is there a better place for it now? More like that I think would be good, just give it some thought. Chain linking trade buildings, for instance, could be a neat way to encourage trade across your empire as you build up. There's an interesting forward supply building in the military category, but I never once ran out of supplies, so I think some balancing maybe would, make that stuff a bit more useful. Next up is recruitment. Recruitment in Three Kingdoms is really weird compared to the previous games. You first recruit a character, and that character has a color-coded specialization. Let's take Green for example. Green is a champion character, and for units, Green is a spear or defensive unit. Okay, so with a Green character, you can recruit any Green unit you want. Pretty simple. However, you can also recruit any other colored unit, but not all of them. I have no idea what really determines this. I thought it was based on tier, like a purple could never get a high tier green, but they can. So it's some sort of restriction on the mid tier of units. My purple general can get the best spear infantry, or the worst, but she can't get the mid tier spear infantry. Okay. A character will also have semi-random special units. These are units that they're just allowed to recruit if the character ranks up. These aren't based on the color, they're just different depending on the general. So it's like an exception, you know, like my red guy can take certain blue units as well. Then there's hidden things, like a blue general can only recruit artillery. It's not displayed anywhere, you're just supposed to know that. So if you want artillery, you gotta go blue. When you decide on what you want and recruit the unit to the character, they become part of their retinue. This means that if you disband the character, the units will go with them. If you re-recruit them, the units come back, and they keep their veterancy. So they're basically just attached to each other. Now when recruited, the unit will be in a weakened state, and it'll then replenish over time to full strength. If the unit dies, it'll just go away for 1 or 2 turns, and then come back, again, keeping its veterancy. Higher tier units are then tied to the technology tree, so if you want to get better units, you have to wait until they unlock. You can recruit anything anywhere as long as you're in home territory. Without buildings that produce units, all unit recruitment is just global. Personally, I really dislike this system. I can see what they're going for. You know, characters are the focus, units are part of them. They provide buffs to certain units, and their units never die. Even if the character dies, you can transfer the units to a new one. So units kind of come from these global reforms, and you can just recruit them anywhere, wherever the character is. I get it. And I appreciate that CA have tried something different. I don't think they should always stick to the script and make formulaic releases. But I don't think this is a good system and better than what we've had before. And frankly, I don't really think it needed to change much. This system has no location recruiting, so units have no real sense of presence. Like having unique units in certain places of the map, Nanhai warriors or Guanling spearmen, something to add a bit of flavor. There's no loss of veterancy even if a unit is wiped completely, they're just totally dehumanized. There's essentially no consequence to losing a unit other than wait a turn. There's no armor upgrades or weapon upgrades to give to units, and there's no promotion system where maybe a low-ranking spearman turns into a veteran or an elite eventually through reforms. These things would add some depth to the units and diversify the battles a bit. Those are the reasons I miss them or want them instead of this system. Now, some cool things are achieved with the current system. You essentially have these sub-commanders in battle, which is cool. You know, having a red general leading the red cavalry and then ranking him up to provide buffs to his cavalry or whatever his retinue is, that's cool. They sort of feel like officers in that way, which I think is quite a neat idea. It can be a little bit weird, you know, you could get a blue general who provides fire arrows to his archers, but not to the rest of the army. So having segmented abilities across the same units within a battle, I don't think that's good, but I suppose that is the trade-off for recruiting to your proper color. Now, another cool thing with this sub-commander idea is that if the commander dies, only the retinue will lose morale, not the entire battlefield. So again, I like that aspect to the attachment of units. Now, seeing as we're talking about characters, let's take a deeper look at them. So characters in Three Kingdoms are really the focus, and they're pretty good. We've already touched on how they tie to recruitment and the color-coded system that goes with them. It's worth mentioning that this system attempts to tie everything in the game together. It's the Wu Jing elements, and these 5 colors represent units, buildings, characters, character traits, attributes, skills, ancillaries, and technologies, so it is everywhere. For a character, their color is predetermined, and it shapes their 5 attributes: expertise, resolve, cunning, instinct, and authority. Each of these attributes affects 2 stats. Cunning, for instance, will increase ammunition and military supplies. And when a character levels up, they'll earn a skill point, and you can then get abilities to increase their attributes further. And when you reach over 100 with a certain attribute, the character will become classed as legendary, and I believe they won't die as easily. Characters then have an in-depth equipment system: a weapon, armor, horse, follower, and accessory. These are known as ancillaries. They also have really great artwork and provide a lot to the character. Getting a good ancillary that adds public order, then placing him in an administrator position feels very satisfying to do. You'll get to know your characters as good governors, great generals, and high-ranking officials. I thought I would struggle to remember the names and artwork, but I really did get somewhat attached to them and roleplayed with them a little bit. This was definitely made a lot easier with the offices screen and the family tree. The structure in place helped me remember who they were, what they did, and why they were valuable. Placing people in high-ranking positions, marrying my sons and daughters off, and watching the family grow was really nice, and I think it's paced quite well, given that the game runs at 5 turns per year, so you've got a long time with these people, and it takes about 90 turns for a kid just to come of age. And it's sad to see the older generations die out when they become highly skilled, you're gonna miss them. Characters also have something called satisfaction. It's a mechanic that basically requires you to grant them promotions and pay them more as they get more influential to keep them happy. Playing predominantly as Sun Jin, this was a very forgettable mechanic because of his satisfaction buffs. As he builds up his heroism, all of his characters globally just are more satisfied. But I think generally it is still a nice idea. It seems that even for other factions, it's not that punishing. Most unhappy characters will just leave your court. But I would hope that they're, just a little bit more likely to cause a civil war, so there's real consequence to trying to make everyone happy. I believe this can happen, but in testing, I almost just couldn't force it to happen. It's really difficult to do. Now, one thing I don't think worked, or works as of yet, is the character traits and relations system. Essentially, based on their traits, they'll make friends or rivals with other characters. This then causes events to occur sometimes. It's entirely ignorable, which is why I don't think it works. Having a friend or rival doesn't really change anything, and because there's no character interactions, there's very limited ways you can influence it. It's basically going to amount to keep people together and they'll probably be happier, but even rivals will have benefits. If you're in a battle with a rival in your army, you'll actually do more damage. It's arguably better than having a friend where you'll do more evasion. One nice benefit of it though is just the roleplay aspect. I had 2 rivals in my army, and in one tough battle one of them died, and it now lists him as dead in the relations panel, and it shows a list of the interactions they had with my faction leader, including that final battle. It's just kinda cool. Without adding some sort of active interaction system and real consequence to having relationships, the whole thing does feel a little bit pointless beyond just that bit of flavor. You get all this info about what your person likes or dislikes, and it just doesn't matter, at least it didn't to me. It's worth mentioning the family tree and government positions. Now these are great. Family tree pretty much just does what it says and definitely helped me keep track of people. The government expands as you grow, which is pretty cool, and the positions have base stats that the characters then also bring their own buffs and debuffs on top of, depending who you put where. Now towards the end it gets a little bit messy deciding who should go where, and it probably doesn't matter as much by then, but generally it's a pretty good character system and definitely the best in a Total War game. It could do with some aging in the portraits though. I mean, it's really weird to see like a 40-year-old, 18-year-old basically. Next to move on to is diplomacy. Diplomacy in this game is the best it's ever been. There's options to do pretty much anything you want. You can trade territories, food, items, you can marry other characters, and then combine factions. You can confederate, form alliances, form these coalition soft alliances. You can support people's independence, guarantee their autonomy, set their war targets individually. It's really, really great. It's nearly perfect, honestly. The only thing for me is your reliability rating. I was always becoming treacherous. I mean, maybe it knows me a bit too well. Because I'd have an ally, and then I'd be at war with someone. Then I'd get peace. Then that person would attack my ally, and I'd be forced to either join the war, thus breaking my peace, or refuse my ally, thus breaking my alliance. So there's a little few kinks in there for sure that I think they could kind of work out, and trading 4 items and getting a city out of it is a bit weird, but other than that, very minor gripes. The system really is great. In my campaign actually I had many vassals and I'd set them targets and they'd actually go ahead and do them if they weren't getting killed. It's still a rarity to really fight side by side them, which would have been nice, but even so, it worked out pretty well. Once my vassal was big enough, I just annexed them and I grew really quickly. Everything they conquered, I got in the end. A few times my vassals were in trouble and then I'd actively try to help them out, fight with them and then conquer territory, and then I could just give them the territory. Region trading really does work very well in this, and it's great to see it back. There's honestly not much else to say here. It's a great system. There's a lot of thought and care put into it. There's even options unique to other factions, which works great. It's also pretty well balanced. I mean, I don't see it really being gamed that often, apart from maybe just the item values are quite high, but Yeah, generally speaking, it's very, very good, and it has to stay on for future titles. They're just going to feel empty without it. The great thing about this system is that I don't think they'll really need to add much to it. They basically thought of everything. The only thing I wanted to do but couldn't was demanding the transfer of a vassal in a peace deal. I think that'd be cool, but that's my own minor gripe. Sort of an offshoot of diplomacy is the new spy system. I don't want to spend too long on this because you could talk about the options for a very long time. Essentially, you can now place a character in the recruitment pool of another faction. If they recruit them, you then get progress reports about them and can check in on them. They build up two resources slowly over time, network points and cover points. You spend network to achieve things at the expense of cover. Depending on what your character is, a governor, general, or in the family, you can do different things. It's fairly RNG based to get them in these positions, though you can try and influence it a little bit. I had spies at multiple times at the head of armies and even fought against them, which was weird. I mean, these guys will literally die to keep their cover. Now, the reality is they're just blanketly set to being part of the enemy. They're not really aware as an entity that they are a spy. I guess it's just easier that way. Now, I tried to make use of this as much as possible to really test out the feature, but ultimately I just think it's quite boring. I check in every few turns and I could hurt their supplies or something like that, and it just never really seemed to matter, you know? I do think it's a cool idea though, but I just haven't seen a need for it. The best use I got out of it was that my spy was actually laying an ambush to kill my own army, and I just happened to look where he was. The camera just panned over to an empty area, and I removed him, so in a way I avoided an ambush because of the spy system, but I feel like, you know, not even my spy reported to me that he was going to try and ambush my faction leader. I mean, that's the kind of intel I think would be valuable and I think you should get from having a spy in the field. Now, last thing I want to touch on for the campaign is just my general playthrough and pacing. The campaign is pretty well paced in my opinion. The objective is to work your way up the ranking until you reach king or queen status, and the first 3 kingdoms to do so will then declare themselves emperor and their capital cities become emperor seats. You take all 3 seats, you win the game. The way you build up your faction rank is with prestige, and that's earned on buildings. Those buildings are tied to technologies, and technologies improve at a set rate. Every 5 years you get new technology, you can't speed up or slow down that. So the campaign has a pretty general pace to it, where it takes you about 200 turns to win. 200 turns is only 40 years in game, so you typically only pass 1, maybe 2 generations in your family. Because you only build 1 building at a time as well, I think the game has a great pacing to it, where it's a very natural progression forward. However, I do think it slightly makes new playthroughs a bit dull, as the pace doesn't really change. And that's really it for the campaign. For the sake of time, I've glanced over a few things like trade, events, and missions. It's all fine. It's not really worth bringing up to me. Now, let's move on to the battles. Battles in this game are extremely arcadey, but they are very fun. I'll expand on that, but I wanted to reiterate that I'm playing records mode, and I played the game with extreme unit size, so a typical full army was about 3,500 troops on average. So first up, I wanted to mention the presentation. The battle environments are amazing. I think this is probably the best looking Total War game for its environments, landscapes and lighting. Obviously, a skull mountain in Warhammer looks pretty impressive, but for the skybox, the ground textures, the fog on the maps, the weather effects, the fire effects, the surrounding details, I just think it looks really great. It also uses procedural map generation, I think, or it's pulling from a very large set of tiles. Either way, it doesn't matter. If you can't tell the difference, then it's working. Essentially, battle maps always represent the campaign location perfectly in my playthrough. I never had an instance of repeat maps in different places in the world, unless maybe it was obviously like a town or something like that. Reinforcements, they come in where they should. If they're coming in from a town, you'd see the town in the distance, and they'd march in from the town at their backs. Great stuff. For the units, I'm of two minds. The style of animation that they've gone for is clearly over the top, exaggerated and kind of arcadey and stuff. And that's just not something I'm all that into. The detail and quality on the units is very good. Again, it's just the style, which I guess is preference, but to me, without the troops kind of feeling alive, I don't really have a reason to care about them, and I don't get any enjoyment from watching people swipe at the air and then dramatically lunge backwards without the realism there. It's kind of like watching toy soldiers just bumping into each other. Certain aspects have greatly improved though. The animations of cavalry, they look a lot more organic, and the cavalry to cavalry charges look excellent, best they've ever been. It really is an impact you feel. Units now also have a delayed response in moving off the spot, which again looks very organic. I really like that. The audio callouts and the noises of units chanting when they lock into formations is also really great. I think for me, I enjoy the battles most, probably when I'm about 100 to 200 foot in the air, which granted is most of the time. Everything from up there looks really amazing. The push and pull of the units, the weight of the charges, and the audio and environments from up there, it's all great. You zoom in closer than that and it kind of immediately takes me out of the experience personally. I can't help it. Seeing units completely miss each other, get turned around, stutter as they try to kind of line up, phase through each other and stuff like that, it's just painful to watch. Painful for me anyway. In older games, they had troops look tired when they were tired. They say things to each other, they get anxious and bang their shields if the enemy was close by, things like that. That stuff isn't in this game, not anymore. Some people might be wondering about matched combat where two units engage in a synced animation. That is in this game. It's in it as finishing moves. It's a pretty rare occurrence. I'd say it's in there like maybe a 5% chance of happening between two fighters, but it does happen. I think it looks good when it happens. You'd see someone drive a spear into someone's neck and you're like, damn, that looked good. There's also the bespoke animations for the duels where much more elaborate combat takes place. Now they get pretty familiar pretty quickly, but they do look quite good and they have a few surprises in there. You know, a few things get turned around and you're like, whoa, crazy. But again, I just think organic matched combat is best when you're watching a fight and suddenly kind of in the corner of your eye you just see two guys having a duel of their own. You know, when you're focused in on two people that you know are going to fight that way, it's just oddly not as interesting. Not to me. Anyway, enough about the visuals, let's talk variety. There's plenty of variety in terms of unit class in Three Kingdoms. You have melee infantry, swords and axes, polearm infantry, ranged units with bows, crossbows and repeater crossbows, ranged cavalry archers, shock and melee cavalry, artillery. However, while there might be a good mix of categories, they don't really have that many units within them. There's around 30 to 35 base units for your faction, which seems like a lot, but it is shared between all factions, so it does get a bit repetitive. There are one or two unique units per faction then as well, but not enough in my opinion to make multiple playthroughs really feel distinct. Now I understand the argument of it being one culture and all that, but China is a big place. I would always prefer to see a bit more variation between the north, south, east and west that could visually distinguish them and add a bit of flavour, like maybe northern archers are better and southern cav is stronger, maybe differentiate between light and heavy a bit more, then add some increased veterancy stages along the way, maybe throwing in another tier. You could get a lot of variation out of one culture if you just break it up and maybe make more regional units. The roster is a little bit slim in my opinion and it does get repetitive pretty quickly. Battle variation is also somewhat repetitive. There's no river crossing battles or naval battles, which I would be okay with, but nothing has really replaced it. You know, you have these big square sieges now, but only a battering ram or a hole in the wall as your equipment. There's no ladders, there's no siege towers or interesting artillery pieces, just the one. It gets a little bit old. Then there's forts. You have one type of fort and that's it. You know, with the sacrifice of no naval in one culture, I just hoped we'd see a little bit more battle options. Like, I came across a fort on a river on the campaign, and I remember thinking, damn, if this had like a bespoke fort map like embedded on a river or with its back to a river, it'd be a really challenging assault. It'd be a really cool battle. But instead, it's just a normal fort type fight, which is fine, you know, but I'm just trying to be real, it does get repetitive kind of fast. Now, that just might seem like a bit of nitpicking, and maybe it sort of is, because what I played I enjoyed. I really liked the battles in this game, especially the minor settlement battles. For some reason, sieges rarely have a garrison, so you play them a lot less, and they're not that interesting because of it, because they're often empty. But the tight lanes of a settlement fight, where they're attacking or defending, are quite fun, and the AI is pretty good too. My only issue with the AI is that they don't seem to wait to gather their forces to attack as one. They often filter in one by one, especially when they've got reinforcements. They also have no concept of no-go regions on the battlefield. If a big village is your anchor in a battle, the AI don't actually know that that's there. It's just a blank land battle to them. They try and fight a battle as they normally would, but the pathfinding will then kind of override them and funnel into a certain area. Now, that's not an AI decision saying, oh, there's something there, I'm going to move. It's just automatic pathfinding after they've made their decision already, and it can often just result in weird behavior from them. Now, before some of you scoff at me and say, oh, well, on Legendary AI, the AI is much better. You should have been playing on Legendary. Now, I know Legend of Total War showed that there's some built-in anti-cheese AI for if you play Legendary, which is really good, and I've tested it myself and thought about what's happening there for a while. My conclusion on this is that there's a few anti-cheese clauses in there for Legendary, which I'm honestly amazed that they actually address for the 1% that do it. But from my testing, that does seem to be where it stops. I couldn't get them to flank differently, wait for reinforcements, try to use their ammo before engaging, or do pretty much anything differently across the different difficulties. I do think it's pretty good AI for Total War, at least. It's gotten a bit better, which is good. If you sit back and try to bombard a town, they'll often come out. When I lined up at the gates of a settlement, they actually rappelled down the walls to attack me, which surprised me a lot, and slowed me down considering I had to try and get into the city. It was kind of super buggy, but they still did it. Now, my tests, they're not foolproof. I've tested a few different battles, trying to do the same thing, tried it on lots of different difficulties, and often the cases, the AI just performed the exact same. Now, I've actually studied AI, and I worked at CA for a bit, and I have a little bit of insider knowledge on how their AI works. I just don't believe that the AI is really smart on Legendary and just really dumb on Easy, just in case anyone was thinking that. It's the same AI instance running with seemingly a few overrides in there if you're on Legendary. That's my educated guess on the matter, because I think developing a system that shifts its weights on decision making based on difficulty would be just a QA nightmare for them. The amount of testing required would essentially quadruple for the battles, for the different difficulties, and then you'd have to also emulate a sort of user input, like, oh, what would a novice do? What's a medium player? What's a veteran? How hard should Legendary be? To try and get the results correct. It'd be a real mess. I'm pretty confident anyway, that this is just an anti-cheese thing. But hey, it's still an improvement. Now, number one priority for me with the AI at this point would be making armies link up together before fighting you, and on the campaign, I'd have it so they actually encourage big battles a bit more often at cities. Instead of sieging a city and then attacking your reinforcing army to kind of kill them away one by one. Like, that does make sense to do, but it is bad design to allow that to happen. You deny the player a fun battle. It's almost impossible to have a siege where the defender has two armies because of it. Because if they've got two armies, they will just 2v1 you every time by locking down the siege. And that's essentially it for battles. Big thumbs up for settlements, and just for the fun factor and pacing of battles. Sieges are fun, but the campaign kind of limits them a bit much, and there's not many breaching options or defense options. There's some nice improvements to collision and charges, and the AI is pretty decent. Now, I'm not a fan of the cartoony animations, but that's just aesthetic. It's still beautiful, and that's kind of personal preference anyway. The scale is great. I love having battles with 10,000 troops, even if it does lag my PC, and there's not that many bugs. The worst offender was a map encased in water that wasn't really there, and a few repelling bugs on walls, but generally everything was pretty good. It does seem to have a lot of slowdown when a lot of projectiles are firing, but I guess that's just a CPU bottleneck kind of thing. Very last thing to go into for my review is the UI. I can't stand the UI in this game. I get what they're going for with the Chinese watercolor stuff, but it feels more like Chinese water torture, man. I'm suffocating with ink panels and buried menus just to find a reason for something. Like, did you know a level 4 strategist gives formations to the army? How would you ever know that? Even after it happens, you then have to go through panels and panels to figure out, and lists to figure out where that is. You have to do a deep dive to see what units you can make and why, and diplomacy events often tell you that someone wants something and you don't know where they are because you just can't click their name, it locks you out. I've received invites of alliances from people I haven't even encountered, but they'd somehow encountered me. I thought it was supposed to be a two-way thing. Only after I accepted did their faction appear. I mean, that's weird. Now, Some stuff is really great though, quality of life stuff I guess, where you can see what commanderies aren't active, what people have movement, you know, who's missing skills, filters on characters and diplomacy and armies. Like functionally, a lot of stuff is actually great, but there really is a lot of just confusion when you first start playing, as there's no real tutorial other than just these tooltips. Now the tooltips can give you pretty good info, but it doesn't teach you how and why to use something or find something. Like it'll say, special units do this, but I want to know what determines a special unit. Like, why does he have special units? Why? He has 4, the other guy has 6, they're both green, what's the deal? What about corruption? Corruption suffocated my campaign in the mid-game because I started expanding into the wasteland that is southern China. No idea, by the way, why this is left so empty. Do not go south. There's nothing there but boredom and DLC. But anyways, expanding out there grew my corruption up to 70%, and then I tried looking up the causes and what I should do. There's no answer. There's nothing about it. If you're a new player, I genuinely do not know what you would do. You'd have to just go through the building browser very slowly until you hoped to see something that removed corruption. But you wouldn't know, why am I getting corruption? Like, why? I think just based on other Total Wars, it's based on how many cities you have. I think that's basically it. Now, I think if Total War want to avoid making tutorials and using the system that they have, that's fine, but they need a civilization type encyclopedia, so you can just search the word corruption and it'll tell you what it is, or whatever you're stuck on. That'd pretty much solve everything, to be honest, with regards to learning stuff. I mean, it would still be a pain to learn, but at least the info would be there. Now, this isn't to say the artwork is bad. The art is excellent. I love the look of buildings, and the characters and the items, they all look fantastic. They're really detailed and very creative. The map itself looks really, really good as well, but unfortunately, it's always enshrouded with UI and overlays and just ink everywhere. When you hide the UI, you finally see how beautiful the map is. I just wish they decluttered it, because I really feel they cover up one of their very strongest visual assets in the game. And that's about all the time I have for my review here. I think Total War 3 Kingdoms is a very good Total War game. It's not entirely for me, mostly because of its aesthetic choices and character focus on the romance side. You know, I'm not familiar with who Dong Zhuo is, so I just can't really connect with the characters in the game that much beyond just the stories I create myself. But I can still appreciate that it's a very solid entry into the franchise. I don't know if it personally has the replay value for me to go back to it that often, mostly because, you know, I've worked out the settlement management now, and I've seen almost all the units in the game, but I do think it's a fun, almost kind of spin-off game really, where a lot of things were turned on their head. You know, recruiting from characters, locking tech rates, focusing in on one goal for all the factions, experimenting with character-driven interactions and things like that. It was a fun, very arcadey Total War experience, and I think it's brought some big improvements to the franchise, with diplomacy and characters especially. I hope that stuff is iterated on in future, and maybe they try to make a more grounded approach once more. Just give it one more go for the next historical title. I'd just like to see what that would be like. Now, something I forgot to mention, and it's often overlooked in reviews, is the audio design and music. I have to say, it's probably the best soundtrack since Shogun 2. And the audio design on the UI, as well as the troops, when they clashed, the little campaign effects of hearing people walking around, wind and dust blowing, jungles and stuff, really brought the game to life with a high degree of quality. Really great stuff. And that is it for my review. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and apologies for taking so long with it. I wanted to beat a campaign before doing it, and I had some other stuff come up for my patrons, which I just kind of wanted to take care of first. So I'm going to get in the habit of letting people know about the channel a little bit more at the end of videos. We have a Discord, lots of people in there, and some people are going to be organizing official multiplayer games in Total War, Stellaris, and Imperator soon. Just need to get the kind of mods set up ready to do that. As well as that, I'm affiliated with CD Keys. If you want to get this game plus its DLC 30% off, you can use my link in the description, or any game for that matter. It all helps. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at @ROP_tweets or at DarrenROP. And if you want to help fund this channel, consider heading over to Patreon, where you can get priorities in our Discord for multiplayer games, request streams, get discounts on merch, and help me keep going. 70% of the income that I make is through fan funding, so thank you very much to everyone who does support. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.